The Black Plague, also known as the Black Death, remains one of the most cataclysmic events in human history. Sweeping across Europe between 1347 and 1351, it decimated populations, destabilized societies, and transformed the trajectory of the continent's history. In just a few years, it claimed the lives of an estimated 25 to 50 million people, nearly one-third to one-half of Europe's total population at the time. This staggering mortality rate has immortalized the plague not merely as a medical disaster, but as a turning point that reshaped Europe's social, cultural, economic, and political landscapes. The plague was not Europe's first encounter with epidemic disease, but its sudden ferocity and unprecedented death toll set it apart from previous calamities. Unlike famine, which was relatively common in the Middle Ages and often limited to specific regions, the plague spread with frightening speed across the entire continent. Unlike warfare, which typically affected armies and local populations, the plague ignored boundaries of class, status, or geography, striking nobles and peasants, city dwellers and rural farmers alike. It inspired terror, despair, and a re-evaluation of humanity's place in the divine order. Here we will examine the Black Plague in its full complexity, exploring not only its biological and epidemiological origins, but also its profound impact on the course of European civilization. To understand the enormity of the plague's devastation, it is essential to first consider the world into which it erupted. A Europe already burdened by economic pressures, fragile social structures, and deep religious convictions that would both frame and distort its response to the catastrophe. On the eve of the Black Death, Europe in the early 14th century was a continent in flux. The High Middle Ages, roughly spanning the 11th to the 13th centuries, had brought periods of population growth, agricultural expansion, and urban development. By 1300, Europe's population had swelled to unprecedented levels. Some historians estimate as high as 75 to 80 million. Cities such as Florence, Paris, and London bustled with activity, while trade networks connected Europe more extensively than ever before. Yet this growth had also brought with it pressures that strained the medieval system to its limits. Agriculture formed the backbone of the medieval economy, but the land was overworked and increasingly unable to sustain the growing population. The so-called Malthusian crisis was already evident, too many people competing for too few resources. Harvests were vulnerable to poor weather, and when a series of famines struck in the early 14th century, most notably the Great Famine of 1315–1317, millions were left weakened and malnourished. These famines not only killed hundreds of thousands, but also lowered resistance to disease, creating fertile ground for epidemics to spread once they arrived. Politically, Europe was fractured. The feudal system still dominated, with kings, nobles, and lords controlling vast swathes of territory. However, centralized monarchies were beginning to emerge, particularly in France and England. Conflict simmered between kingdoms, and the 100 Years' War, 1337–1453, between England and France had just begun as the plague made its approach. Armies on the move, combined with weakened populations and strained resources, created an environment ripe for devastation. Religiously, Europe was deeply Christian, with the Roman Catholic Church exerting powerful influence over daily life, moral authority, and intellectual pursuits. The Church was the ultimate source of explanation for natural and human events. Disease, famine, and disaster were frequently interpreted as divine punishments for sin. This mindset shaped the ways in which medieval Europeans perceived and responded to the plague. Prayer, penance, and scapegoating often took precedence over medical inquiry. Culturally, Europe of the early 14th century was vibrant but also rigid. Universities had grown across the continent, scholasticism shaped intellectual life, and Gothic cathedrals were architectural marvels. Yet science and medicine were still rudimentary, heavily influenced by the ancient writings of Galen and Hippocrates, often filtered through Arabic scholarship. Doctors lacked a true understanding of contagion, relying instead on theories of bad air, miasma, imbalances of the four humours, or divine wrath to explain illness. In short, Europe before the Black Plague was already vulnerable, overpopulated, undernourished, politically unstable, and medically unprepared. Into this fragile world entered one of the most devastating pandemics in recorded history. The Black Plague was caused by a bacterium known today as Yersinia pestis. This microorganism, first identified in the late 19th century by Swiss bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin, thrives in the blood of small mammals, particularly rodents, and is carried from host to host by fleas. When infected fleas bite, the bacteria are transmitted into new hosts, whether animal or human. There are three main forms of plague infection. One, bubonic plague, the most common and infamous type, named after the swollen, painful lymph nodes, buboes, that developed in the groin, armpit, or neck. Symptoms included fever, chills, vomiting, and a mortality rate of 30 to 60% if untreated. 2. Pneumonic plague, a lung infection that could be transmitted from person to person via droplets in the air. This form killed even faster than bubonic plague, often within days, with mortality approaching 90–100%. 3. Septicemic plague, the rarest but deadliest form where bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. Victims often died within 24 hours, sometimes before visible symptoms appeared. Although medieval Europeans did not understand microbiology, they observed the terrifying swiftness of the disease, its gruesome symptoms, and its indiscriminate nature. In hindsight, modern science reveals that the combination of rodent populations, fleas, and unhygienic conditions created a perfect storm for plague transmission. Most historians and epidemiologists trace the origins of the Black Plague to the vast grasslands of Central Asia. Here, wild rodent populations, such as marmots and gerbils, served as natural reservoirs for Yersinia pestis. Nomadic peoples, caravans, and armies frequently came into contact with these animals. The Silk Road, the great trade network connecting China, the Middle East, and Europe, provided the channels for disease to travel great distances. Evidence suggests that the plague may have erupted in or near China in the early 1330s. Chinese records report devastating epidemics in the region, with entire communities wiped out. From there, the disease traveled westward, carried along the caravan routes of the Silk Road, eventually reaching the shores of the Black Sea. The Mongol Empire, which had created the largest contiguous land empire in world history during the 13th century, unintentionally facilitated the spread of the plague. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol domain stretched from China to Eastern Europe, encompassing vast territories and enabling unprecedented levels of exchange of goods, ideas, and, unfortunately, diseases. One infamous episode illustrates this transmission. In 1346, the city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia in Crimea, was besieged by Mongol armies. According to accounts by the Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, the besieging Mongols, themselves suffering from the plague, catapulted the corpses of infected soldiers over the city walls, in what some historians consider an early form of biological warfare. The terrified Genoese merchants inside Kaffa fled by ship, inadvertently carrying the disease with them to Mediterranean ports. While historians debate the accuracy of de Mussi's account, the story reflects the reality. War, trade, and human migration were the conduits that brought plague into new lands. By the mid-1340s, plague had established a foothold in the ports of the Black Sea, a hub of east-west trade. From there, it spread rapidly to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a critical gateway between Europe and Asia. The city was a densely populated trade center, and outbreaks there ensured the disease would not remain confined. Genoese and Venetian trading ships carried infected fleas and rats into Mediterranean harbors. Sicily, Messina, and Genoa were among the first European ports struck in 1347. Within months, the plague had leapt from one coastal city to another, before making its way inland along roads and rivers. The Mediterranean world was especially vulnerable due to its bustling maritime commerce. Fleets carried goods such as grain, cloth, and spices, ideal hiding places for plague-bearing rats. Once aboard, fleas could survive for weeks, jumping from rat to rat or, in the absence of rodents, biting human passengers and crew. Thus, the plague's arrival in Europe was not a sudden invasion, but the final step in a long journey that began in the wilds of Central Asia. The outbreak of the Black Plague was not simply the result of a bacterium's existence. It was the product of an interconnected medieval world. Several conditions converged to make the pandemic possible: Ecological reservoirs in Central Asia kept the bacteria alive in rodent populations. Trade networks such as the Silk Road and Mediterranean shipping lanes carried infected fleas and humans across vast distances. Mongol expansion and warfare disrupted populations and exposed armies and merchants to new pathogens. Urban overcrowding and poor sanitation in medieval Europe made cities death traps once the plague arrived. The plague's arrival in Europe was, in a sense, inevitable given these factors. Its rapid spread would soon become one of the defining horrors of the 14th century. The year 1347 marked the moment when the Black Plague finally entered Europe in a way that could no longer be contained. Genoese trading ships, fleeing the siege of Caffa on the Crimean coast, carried rats and fleas infected with Yersinia pestis into the central Mediterranean. When these ships reached Messina in Sicily, local inhabitants were horrified to discover crews already dead or dying. Contemporary accounts describe sailors collapsing at the oars, their bodies covered in blackened buboes. The authorities of Messina attempted to quarantine the ships, but it was too late. From Sicily, the disease spread outward rapidly. Ships continued to dock at Genoa, Venice, and Marseille, major commercial centers where trade could not simply be halted. These bustling harbors, teeming with rats that thrived on grain cargo, provided the perfect breeding ground for the plague. By the end of 1347, plague outbreaks had erupted in Italy and southern France, marking the start of a catastrophic chain reaction. The sea was the great highway of plague transmission. Medieval trade ships carried spices, wool, and grain, but in their dark holds lived stowaways, black rats, ratus ratus, which flourished in close proximity to humans. The fleas that infested these rats transmitted the bacterium when rat populations died off, forcing fleas to seek new hosts, often the sailors and dock workers themselves. Attempts at containment proved futile. Quarantine as a concept existed in rudimentary form. Cities like Venice eventually experimented with isolating ships for 40 days, 40 giorni, from which the word quarantine derives. But in 1347 and 1348, these methods were not yet widespread or rigorously enforced. Commerce was too vital, and ignorance of germ theory meant authorities could not identify the real culprits. By early 1348, the plague had moved inland. Once it reached Florence, one of Europe's wealthiest and most populous cities, the devastation was catastrophic. Giovanni Boccaccio, in the introduction to his Decameron, described how the sickness struck suddenly, producing swollen lymph nodes, black patches of skin, and death within days. Families abandoned one another, bodies piled up in the streets, and funerals became impossible. His testimony captures the speed and terror with which the plague advanced. From Italy, the disease spread northward. Merchants and travelers carried it into France, where it devastated Provence, Lyon, and eventually Paris. France's dense urban centers and active markets ensured that no region remained untouched for long. The Rhône and Seine rivers, along with overland trade routes, acted as conduits of infection. Caravans, horse-drawn carts, and even wandering pilgrims unwittingly ferried the disease deeper into Europe. By mid-1348, plague had entered Spain through Barcelona and Valencia, carried by both sea trade and land connections with southern France. In the summer of 1348, the plague leapt across the English Channel. Ships from Normandy brought the disease into Dorset on England's southern coast. From there, it spread rapidly to Bristol, London, and Norwich. The English chronicler Henry Knighton wrote that scarcely a tenth of mankind remained alive. London, crowded and poorly sanitized, became a death trap. The city's narrow alleys, lack of proper waste disposal, and high population density made it one of the hardest hit areas. Records suggest that the mortality rate in London may have reached 50%. From England, the plague spread into Ireland and Scotland, though accounts suggest it was less devastating in some rural regions than in cities. Nevertheless, entire monastic communities were wiped out, and political instability worsened in regions already fraught with tension. By 1349, the plague swept into the Low Countries, modern Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and the German states. Trade hubs such as Cologne, Hamburg, and Lübeck became major centers of infection. Rivers like the Rhine carried the plague into the interior, devastating towns along its banks. In Scandinavia, ships brought the plague to Norway, where it struck Bergen and Oslo with ferocity. From there, it travelled into Sweden and Denmark, though the more sparsely populated countryside slowed its spread slightly compared to Central Europe. Eastern Europe was not spared either. The plague entered Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans, although some regions fared better due to geographic isolation or quick local responses. Poland, in particular, experienced somewhat lower mortality rates, possibly due to fewer urban centres and slower trade contact, though modern historians debate the reasons. What astonished contemporaries most was the plague's speed of spread. Unlike famines which built slowly over seasons or wars which raged across selected regions, the plague swept across the entire continent in less than 5 years. From its landing in Messina in October 1347, it had reached the farthest edges of Scandinavia by 1350 and Russia by 1351. No corner of Europe remained untouched. Chroniclers often remarked that the disease seemed to move as fast as a horse could travel. While this was an exaggeration, it reflects the perception of a society overwhelmed by a disaster that defied comprehension. As the plague spread from port to city, from city to countryside, it sowed not only death but also fear and chaos. People fled cities, abandoning homes and neighbors in a desperate attempt to escape. Others turned to prayer, pilgrimages, or superstitious rituals. Some believed the end of the world was at hand. For medieval Europeans, the arrival of the Black Plague was more than a medical crisis. It was an existential shock that shattered their sense of order and security. To appreciate how the Black Plague was interpreted, it is crucial to understand the limits of 14th century medicine. European medical theory relied heavily on the works of ancient authorities like Hippocrates and Galen, whose writings had been filtered through Islamic scholars such as Avicenna. Medicine was not based on experimentation or microbiology, but on theory, philosophy, and astrology. Central to this worldview was the concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was thought to depend on keeping these humours in balance. Disease, therefore, was caused by an imbalance, often influenced by environment, diet, or even planetary alignment. Physicians interpreted symptoms through this framework, not through the lens of infection or contagion. This meant that when the Black Plague struck, doctors lacked the conceptual tools to explain it accurately. They could describe its symptoms, the swellings, fevers, and blackened skin, but their explanations and treatments often reflected superstition as much as science. Several explanations were offered by medieval scholars, clerics, and physicians. One miasma theory, bad air. The most widely accepted idea was that plague arose from corrupted air, poisoned by rotting matter, swamp fumes, or astrological disturbances. People believed that inhaling foul odors could cause illness. This led to efforts to purify the air with fires, herbs, or incense. 2. Astrological causes. Some scholars argued that the plague resulted from an unusual conjunction of the planets. The Paris Medical Faculty in 1348 issued a report attributing the plague to a rare alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, which supposedly poisoned the atmosphere. 3. Divine punishment. Beyond medical theories, many saw the plague as a judgment from God. Sinful behavior, greed, pride, and heresy were thought to have provoked divine wrath, with the plague serving as punishment. This interpretation gave rise to public penitence rituals and the infamous flagellant processions. 4. Contagion. A few observers, such as the Italian physician Gentile da Foligno, suggested that plague might spread from person to person. However, this idea was controversial and not universally accepted. While people recognized that being near the sick was dangerous, they explained it as inhaling bad air rather than transmitting germs. Medieval medical practitioners came in many forms. University-trained physicians treated the wealthy and relied on learned theories. Barber surgeons performed practical procedures such as bloodletting or lancing buboes. Apothecaries mixed herbal remedies, potions, and incense. Folk healers and wise women used charms, prayers, and natural remedies passed down through oral tradition. Treatments ranged from the bizarre to the painful. 1. Bloodletting. Doctors often attempted to rebalance the humors by draining blood. This weakened already dying patients and did little to help. 2. Lancing buboes. Surgeons cut open swollen lymph nodes to drain pus, hoping to release toxins. Sometimes patients survived, but often infections worsened. 3. Herbal remedies and potions. Ingredients like wormwood, aloe, and myrrh were common. People also drank concoctions of crushed emeralds, ground pearls, or mercury. 4. Aromatic protection. Because bad air was believed dangerous, people carried posies of flowers, burned incense, or wore pomanders, scented balls, to purify the air around them. 5. Dietary regulation. Physicians advised avoiding fruit, fish, or bathing, believing these opened the pores and allowed plague to enter the body. 6. Superstitious cures. Amulets, prayers, charms, and pilgrimages were common. Some recommended rubbing onions, arsenic, or crushed snake flesh on buboes. Although most medical strategies were ineffective, the Black Plague did inspire early forms of public health measures. Quarantine. In Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, ships arriving from infected areas were isolated for 30 days, later extended to 40, 40 giorni, giving rise to the word quarantine. Though primitive, this practice sometimes slowed spread. Pest houses. Some cities designated hospitals or isolated houses for plague victims, though these often became places of mass death rather than healing. Sanitation efforts. Cities burned aromatic woods or cleansed streets with vinegar and lime to counteract bad air. While these measures rarely halted the plague, they laid the groundwork for later public health systems in Europe. Ultimately, medieval medicine was powerless before the Black Plague. Mortality rates remained staggering. Physicians often fell victim themselves as their close contact with the sick exposed them to infection. Chroniclers frequently remarked that doctors charged enormous fees but provided little help. Still, the experience of the plague forced Europeans to confront the limitations of their medical knowledge. While the germ theory of disease would not emerge until centuries later, the Black Plague highlighted the need for new approaches to public health, hygiene, and medicine. For most Europeans in the 14th century, religion was the primary lens through which life and death were understood. When the Black Plague struck with terrifying speed, many saw it as God's judgment upon humanity. Sin, greed, pride, and moral corruption were thought to have provoked divine wrath, with the plague serving as a cleansing punishment. Preachers thundered from pulpits that communities must repent or face further ruin. Some claimed that specific sins, usury, sexual immorality, or heretical beliefs had invited disaster. In this worldview, medicine could not cure what was essentially a spiritual disease. Only prayer, penance, and collective repentance could hope to stay God's hand. In many cities, people organized public rituals of repentance. Processions wound through the streets, with participants chanting prayers, carrying relics, or prostrating themselves before crosses. The most dramatic of these were the flagellant movements, which spread across Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of France. Flagellants believed that by whipping themselves publicly, sometimes to the point of severe injury, they could atone for the sins of humanity and appease God's anger. Groups of flagellants traveled from town to town, dressed in white robes marked with red crosses, chanting hymns and lashing their backs in unison. While initially tolerated, these groups often fell under suspicion from the church. Their unauthorized rituals challenged clerical authority, and their message sometimes veered into radicalism. By 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellant movement, fearing it undermined orthodox religious order. Alongside public penance, individuals and families turned to more personal acts of devotion. Pilgrimages to shrines of saints, believed to intercede on behalf of the faithful, became popular. Pilgrims flocked to sites such as Santiago de Compostela in Spain or Canterbury in England, hoping for miraculous healing or protection. Prayer, too, was intensified. Special masses, litanies, and processions were organized, often invoking saints associated with protection from illness, such as Saint Sebastian, martyred by arrows, symbolically linked to pestilence, or Saint Roche, who later became venerated as a patron against the plague. The Catholic Church faced an enormous test of authority during the plague years. On one hand, it remained the central institution of spiritual guidance. Priests administered last rites to the dying, monks and nuns cared for the sick, and bishops organized masses of intercession. On the other hand, the scale of death overwhelmed the clergy. Many priests died while ministering to plague victims, leaving parishes leaderless. In some regions, churches closed, sacraments could not be performed, and ordinary believers felt abandoned. This weakened confidence in the Church's ability to protect its flock. Pope Clement VI, who resided in Avignon, attempted to maintain order. He issued bulls granting remission of sins to plague victims, sanctified new burial grounds, and condemned persecution of minority groups. Yet even the papacy's authority could not stem the tide of despair. Religious fervor sometimes turned to hatred. In their search for an explanation, some communities blamed minorities, particularly Jewish populations, accusing them of poisoning wells or spreading disease deliberately. These accusations were baseless, but panic made reason scarce. Violent pogroms broke out across Europe, especially in Germany and Switzerland. Entire Jewish communities were massacred, driven out, or forced into mass conversions. In Strasbourg in 1349, hundreds of Jews were burned alive. Despite efforts by some city leaders to protect them, the Church's official stance was inconsistent. Pope Clement VI issued bulls defending Jews against false accusations, reminding Christians that Jews suffered from the plague like everyone else. Yet local authorities often ignored such decrees, and popular rage overwhelmed papal influence. For many, the plague seemed a sign of the end times. Medieval Europeans were steeped in apocalyptic imagery drawn from the Book of Revelation, which described pestilence, famine, and death as harbingers of the Last Judgment. Chroniclers described people preparing for the imminent second coming of Christ, convinced that the horrors unfolding around them marked the world's final days. Mystics and visionaries reported dreams and prophecies, some warning of further punishments, unless humanity repented. These apocalyptic currents deepened the atmosphere of dread and shaped the religious imagination of the era. Paradoxically, the plague both deepened religious devotion and undermined faith. Some people clung more tightly than ever to prayer, penance, and ritual. Others, however, grew skeptical of the Church's authority when its prayers seemed ineffective. Its clergy died in droves, and its explanations rang hollow. This tension sowed seeds of doubt that would bear fruit in later centuries, contributing indirectly to the religious ferment that culminated in the Reformation. The Black Plague forced believers to grapple with profound theological questions. Why would a just God allow such indiscriminate suffering? Could the Church truly act as an intermediary in times of crisis? Perhaps the most immediate and shocking effect of the Black Plague was the way it disrupted family life. Under normal circumstances, kinship and community were the strongest bonds in medieval Europe. Families cared for their sick, buried their dead, and upheld traditions of loyalty. But the plague overwhelmed these bonds. Chroniclers describe scenes of parents abandoning children, and children abandoning parents, out of sheer terror of infection. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote in the Decameron that brother abandoned brother, uncle his nephew, sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. For many, survival instinct overpowered love and duty. Communities too broke down. Villages were left half empty, their fields unplowed and their markets deserted. City streets fell silent except for the tolling of death bells. Fear of contagion turned neighbors against one another, as suspicion and mistrust replaced solidarity. The mortality of the Black Plague was unlike anything Europe had seen. Estimates vary, but between 25 and 50 million people perished between 1347 and 1351, out of a total European population of around 75 million. Some regions lost a third of their people, others nearly half. In some towns, entire neighborhoods vanished. Chroniclers reported villages so thoroughly depopulated that they disappeared from the map. In London, Florence, and Paris, corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Death was no longer an individual event, but a communal catastrophe. The Church traditionally insisted on proper burial rites, consecrated ground, prayers for the soul, and orderly ceremonies, but the sheer volume of death made these impossible. Priests could not keep up with last rites, and gravediggers could not keep up with the corpses. In Florence, pits were dug where dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies were thrown together without ceremony. Similar mass graves appeared in cities across Europe. This horrified the faithful, who feared that improper burial would endanger the souls of the dead. The breakdown of sacred ritual contributed to the sense of spiritual crisis. The plague touched every aspect of daily life. Markets closed, schools shut down, and courts ceased to function. Fear of contagion reshaped social behavior. People avoided crowds, gatherings, and even their own neighbors. In cities, silence and emptiness replaced the bustle of normal life. At the same time, others responded with hedonism and excess. If life was short and uncertain, why not enjoy what remained? Some chroniclers noted people drinking, gambling, or indulging in forbidden pleasures, living as though tomorrow might never come. This stark contrast between fear and reckless abandon became one of the defining social features of plague years. The plague struck at the heart of medieval institutions. The church, as discussed earlier, was overwhelmed, with clergy dying at high rates. Hospitals, already primitive, could not cope. Even civic governments struggled. Officials either fled or died, leaving cities leaderless. In England, Parliament could not meet regularly. In Italy, city councils disbanded. Law and order weakened as criminals exploited the chaos while enforcement waned. Institutions that normally upheld structure and stability faltered under the crushing weight of mortality. Fear and desperation often turned to violence. Minority groups, especially Jews, were targeted as scapegoats. Rumors spread that they had poisoned wells, leading to pogroms in Germany, Switzerland, and elsewhere. Lepers, beggars, and foreigners were also persecuted. In some regions, these outbursts of violence were spontaneous. In others, they were organized by civic authorities desperate to appease public anger. These persecutions deepened the fragmentation of communities, replacing solidarity with suspicion and cruelty. The plague's mortality reshaped family structures. With so many men dead, widows sometimes inherited property and took on roles traditionally reserved for men. Labor shortages also meant women could step into new economic positions, from running farms to working in trades. At the same time, many families were extinguished entirely. Lineages that had endured for centuries vanished in a single generation. The plague was not only a human tragedy, but also a demographic one, altering the composition of households and communities. The social consequences of the Black Plague were not only material, but also psychological. The omnipresence of death created what some historians call a culture of mortality. Art, literature, and religious practice became fixated on death and the fragility of life. Images of skeletons, the danse macabre, dance of death, and grim reminders of mortality became common. The trauma also lingered in memory. Survivors lived with the constant fear that the plague would return, which it did in periodic outbreaks for centuries. This sense of vulnerability left a deep scar on the collective consciousness of Europe. The most immediate economic effect of the Black Plague was the drastic labor shortage caused by mass mortality. Fields lay fallow, workshops fell silent, and entire villages were abandoned. With up to half of Europe's population gone, the surviving workers suddenly found themselves in high demand. This shift gave laborers newfound leverage. Peasants who once had little bargaining power could now demand higher wages or better conditions. In England, for example, records show that wages for agricultural workers and artisans rose sharply in the decades after the plague. Similarly, in Italy and France, labor became a valuable commodity, altering the rigid balance of feudal society. Landlords, desperate to keep their estates functioning, often had no choice but to agree. This erosion of feudal obligations marked the beginning of the end for Europe's medieval economic order. Feudalism, which had long structured medieval Europe, depended on a large population of peasants bound to the land. The plague undermined this system in several ways. 1. Mortality among serfs drastically reduced the labor force available for lords. 2. Wage demands forced landlords to compete for workers, weakening their control. 3. Peasant mobility increased. Many fled to cities or negotiated new arrangements. 4. Vacant land allowed peasants to acquire plots for themselves. As a result, the traditional bonds of serfdom began to unravel. In Western Europe especially, the plague accelerated the transformation toward a more market-oriented economy, where free peasants worked for wages rather than under obligation. Ruling elites, however, resisted these changes. They feared that rising wages and peasant mobility threatened their authority. In England, the Statute of Labourers, 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of workers. Similar laws appeared in France and other regions. These efforts largely failed. Enforcement was difficult, and labourers often ignored restrictions, Resentment brewed, and in some cases it exploded into revolt. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 was partly fueled by frustrations over wage controls and continued feudal obligations. With fewer hands to work the land, agricultural patterns changed. Marginal lands that had been cultivated to feed a booming population were abandoned. Instead, many landlords turned to pastoral farming, especially sheep herding, which required fewer workers but yielded valuable wool for Europe's textile industry. This shift had lasting consequences. England, for example, became a major exporter of wool, helping to lay the foundations for its later commercial dominance. Across Europe, rural landscapes were reshaped as villages shrank or disappeared, and pastures replaced ploughed fields. Cities too faced upheaval. At first, urban economies collapsed under the weight of death and disruption. Markets closed, guilds lost members, and trade slowed. But in the long run, survivors benefited from new opportunities. Guild membership opened up as vacancies appeared, allowing new artisans to enter trades. Merchants inherited or acquired properties and networks, concentrating wealth. Urban wages rose, improving living standards for many who survived. International trade eventually recovered, though with a smaller, more cautious population. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa remained key hubs, but they also invested more heavily in protective measures such as quarantine, reshaping commercial practices. The plague also triggered one of the largest wealth redistributions in medieval history. With entire families wiped out, property and land often reverted to the crown or local lords, or was inherited by distant relatives. Survivors, suddenly enriched by inheritance, found themselves with unexpected wealth. This phenomenon created new opportunities for social mobility. Some peasants rose into the ranks of landholders. Merchants expanded their holdings. A smaller population meant more resources per capita, raising living standards for many of those who endured. The economic consequences of the plague were complex. In some areas, wages rose while the cost of goods dropped due to reduced demand, a form of deflation. In others, scarcity drove up the price of certain goods, especially food, leading to inflation. Overall, the economy contracted in size, but expanded in flexibility. Traditional rigidities weakened, and new economic patterns emerged, paving the way for the late medieval and early modern economy. In the short term, the Black Plague brought misery, disruption, and collapse, but in the long term it contributed to significant structural changes. The decline of feudalism, the rise of wage labor and a more mobile peasantry, shifts in agricultural and urban economies, greater opportunities for social advancement. Some historians even argue that the Black Plague, by disrupting the old order, helped set the stage for the Renaissance and the eventual rise of modern capitalism. Out of devastation came transformation. The Black Plague did not spare kings, nobles, or their households. Royal courts, like peasant villages, lost members to the disease. Some monarchs attempted to flee their capitals to escape contagion, moving courts to more remote locations. Yet even the most powerful rulers could not protect themselves. For example, in England, King Edward III lost 2 of his daughters to the plague. In France, the royal court was devastated by losses among servants and advisors. The idea that no amount of wealth or power could shield rulers from death weakened the aura of invincibility that monarchs cultivated. While kings retained their crowns, their governments were disrupted. Councils, parliaments, and administrative offices could not function normally when officials and scribes perished in large numbers. Decision-making slowed, records were lost, and governance faltered in many regions. The nobility also suffered profound shocks. Their estates depended on peasant labor, which became scarce after the plague. With peasants demanding higher wages or fleeing altogether, lords found themselves unable to maintain their wealth and status as before. Some attempted to enforce stricter controls, reasserting feudal dues and obligations. This provoked resentment, and in some regions, violent revolts erupted. In France, the Jacquerie uprising of 1358 saw peasants rise against the nobility, fueled by grievances about both economic hardship and aristocratic oppression. In England, tensions over labor and feudal duties contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where rebels demanded freedom from serfdom and fairer treatment. These revolts underscored the weakening grip of nobles over the lower classes. The Catholic Church, as both a spiritual and political institution, faced a profound crisis. It remained the most powerful transnational authority in Europe, but its prestige suffered when prayers and rituals failed to halt the plague. Clergy died in huge numbers, creating shortages of priests and bishops. Moreover, the Church's inability to prevent or explain the disaster fueled doubts about its divine authority. While the papacy at Avignon tried to maintain unity, local clerics sometimes resorted to superstition or scapegoating, further eroding trust. Politically, the Church's weakened authority allowed secular rulers to assert greater independence. In some regions, monarchs seized church lands or taxed ecclesiastical revenues more aggressively, exploiting the crisis to consolidate their own power. City governments faced their own challenges. In places like Florence, Venice, and London, officials were responsible for organizing burial, enforcing health measures, and maintaining order. Many fled, leaving power vacuums. Those who remained often struggled to maintain authority. Fear of contagion discouraged public gatherings, so councils and assemblies met less frequently. Meanwhile, social unrest boiled beneath the surface as workers demanded higher wages. Merchants protected their interests, and the poor demanded relief. In Venice, the government established the first plague boards to oversee public health responses, including quarantines and inspections. These early efforts represented an important step toward modern urban governance. The plague struck Europe in the midst of the 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337–1453. The war ground to a temporary halt as both sides were ravaged by disease. Armies disbanded, campaigns were abandoned, and fortresses were left undermanned. When hostilities resumed, they did so in a world forever changed by demographic collapse. Recruitment became harder, costs increased, and the devastation of the countryside compounded the misery of war. At the same time, rulers recognized the fragility of their military systems. This would later contribute to shifts toward professional standing armies, replacing feudal levies that were no longer reliable. The plague also deepened regional divides. Some areas, relatively spared from devastation, attempted to close themselves off from outsiders. Cities posted guards at gates, villages set up barriers, and territories enacted travel bans. While often ineffective, these measures reflected a growing sense of local autonomy in the face of absent or weakened central authority. In some cases, this fostered independence movements. For example, in the fragmented Holy Roman Empire, certain towns used the chaos to assert greater self-rule, weakening imperial oversight. Though devastating in the short term, the plague's political consequences contributed to longer-term transformations. Monarchs gradually consolidated power as weakened nobility and church influence opened opportunities. Urban governments experimented with new public health systems and more centralized forms of civic authority. Popular revolts challenged entrenched elites, sowing early seeds of political consciousness among commoners. In these ways, the Black Plague destabilized the old order, but also laid the groundwork for the rise of stronger nation-states and more participatory forms of governance in later centuries. The Black Plague ushered in what many historians call a culture of death. Death was no longer an abstract theological concept, but an omnipresent, lived reality. With bodies piling in the streets, bells tolling daily, and whole families vanishing, mortality dominated European consciousness. This atmosphere seeped into cultural expression. Art, literature, and religious practice increasingly emphasized the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, and the urgency of spiritual readiness. The plague made existential themes unavoidable, transforming both high culture and popular traditions. One of the most striking cultural responses was the emergence of the danse macabre, dance of death. This artistic motif depicted skeletons leading people of all social ranks, kings, bishops, peasants, merchants, into the grave. Its message was stark. Death is the great equalizer, sparing no one regardless of wealth, power, or piety. Murals of the Dance of Death appeared on church walls and in cemeteries. They reminded viewers of their own mortality and the futility of worldly pursuits. This art was didactic, urging repentance and spiritual preparation, but it also revealed the deep trauma of a society haunted by death. Other artworks depicted grim scenes of plague victims, angels of death, or saints invoked against pestilence such as Saint Sebastian pierced with arrows. Over time, the plague gave medieval art a darker, more macabre tone, contrasting sharply with the serene beauty of earlier Gothic styles. Writers too grappled with the catastrophe. The most famous literary response was Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in Florence in the wake of the plague. The book opens with a harrowing description of plague-ridden Florence, then shifts to a frame story. 10 young Florentines retreat to the countryside, telling tales to pass the time while the city suffers. The stories themselves range from comic to tragic, reflecting both escapism and confrontation with mortality. Another example is Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, composed later in England but shaped by a post-plague world. Themes of death, greed, and moral corruption permeate his tales, echoing the uncertainties left in the plague's wake. Chroniclers across Europe recorded first-hand accounts of the devastation. Some, like the English monk Henry Knighton, described villages emptied and parishes extinguished. Others, like the French physician Guy de Chauliac, recounted their experiences treating the sick. These writings form a grim documentary record, mingling observation with moral reflection. Music also absorbed the trauma of the plague years. Hymns and chants imploring God's mercy became central to worship. The Dies Irae, Day of Wrath, a Latin hymn describing the Last Judgment, gained popularity as it resonated with apocalyptic fears. Popular songs and folk traditions incorporated dark humor and fatalism. Some nursery rhymes, such as Ring Around the Rosie, are popularly, though controversially, linked to plague imagery, though historians debate this association. Regardless, the sense of death lurking in daily life undoubtedly colored oral traditions. The plague also influenced architecture and urban landscapes. In many cities, plague cemeteries were established outside walls to accommodate mass burials. Churches erected chapels dedicated to saints invoked against the plague, such as Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian. Monuments and memorial crosses sometimes commemorated plague victims, while in later centuries, entire plague columns were built in Central Europe as acts of thanksgiving after outbreaks subsided. These enduring structures kept memory of the disaster alive for generations. The cultural reflections of the plague extended into deeper philosophical territory. The emphasis on death encouraged the practice of memento mori, the reminder that you must die. Objects such as skull carvings, hourglasses, and symbolic art served as constant cues to live a pious life in preparation for inevitable death. The plague also fostered a certain fatalism. If death could strike at random, regardless of piety or status, then perhaps the world was more chaotic than previously imagined. Some turned this fatalism into religious zeal, others into skepticism about the established order. Not all cultural responses were solemn. For some, humor became a coping mechanism. Satirical writings mocked corrupt priests or greedy doctors. Comic plays, carnivals, and bawdy songs gave people a way to laugh at misfortune, even in the face of overwhelming loss. Escapism also grew. The frame of the Decameron, young nobles fleeing to tell stories, symbolizes the desire to withdraw from horror, if only temporarily. This mix of grimness and laughter shows the psychological complexity of a society living under the shadow of constant mortality. The cultural imprint of the Black Plague endured long after the initial outbreak. Art remained fascinated with death, literature continued to wrestle with human frailty, and religious practice emphasized penance and preparation. Even centuries later, when new outbreaks occurred, Europeans drew on the imagery and memory of the 14th century to make sense of their suffering. The plague thus reshaped European culture, leaving a legacy of art, literature, and symbolism that reminded survivors and their descendants that death was universal, unpredictable, and inseparable from life itself. Before the Black Plague, European medicine was deeply rooted in tradition rather than experimentation. Physicians relied on ancient authorities such as Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through the writings of Arabic scholars like Avicenna. Theories of the four humors dominated, and treatments like bloodletting, herbal tonics, and dietary adjustments were the norm. The plague revealed the limits of this system with brutal clarity. Learned physicians could not explain its causes accurately, nor could they provide effective treatments. Mortality among the sick remained staggeringly high regardless of what remedies were applied. The crisis forced Europeans to confront the inadequacies of inherited medical wisdom. One of the most important legacies of the plague was the gradual shift toward empirical observation. Some physicians and chroniclers began to record symptoms and outcomes more carefully, noting patterns of contagion. The Italian physician Guy de Chauliac, who lived through the plague in Avignon, described both bubonic swellings and pneumonic transmission in his Chirurgia Magna. His writings represent an early attempt to distinguish clinical forms of the disease. Although these observations did not yet yield accurate theories of infection, they marked a step toward a more evidence-based approach. Over time, the memory of the plague contributed to a growing skepticism about purely theoretical medicine and encouraged experimentation. The Black Plague also spurred the development of public health systems. Cities, desperate to protect themselves, experimented with measures such as quarantine. First used in Ragusa, Dubrovnik in the late 14th century, ships from infected ports were held offshore for 30 to 40 days. This practice spread to Venice and other trading cities. Plague boards. In Venice, officials created permanent boards of health to monitor outbreaks, enforce quarantines, and control movement. Sanitation efforts. Cities attempted to clean streets, regulate waste, and control markets to limit foul odors believed to spread disease. Though based on flawed theories like miasma, these measures had real effects in slowing contagion. They laid the groundwork for later public health institutions in Renaissance and early modern Europe. The plague also transformed hospitals. Before the 14th century, hospitals were primarily religious institutions focused on charity rather than medical treatment. After the plague, demand for organized care increased. Lazarettos plague hospitals. In Italian cities, special hospitals were built to isolate plague victims. Venice opened one of the first permanent plague hospitals on an island in its lagoon in 1423. Expansion of facilities. Towns across Europe established more hospitals, often funded by wealthy patrons as acts of piety. These institutions represented an early recognition of the need to separate the sick from the healthy and to organize care systematically. The Black Plague did not immediately revolutionize medicine. Germ theory was still centuries away, but it did accelerate certain trends. One, disenchantment with classical authorities. As Galen's teachings failed to provide answers, physicians began questioning ancient texts. This critical spirit contributed to the later rise of Renaissance medicine. Two, anatomical study. The shortage of physicians and the urgency of disease encouraged more dissections, paving the way for figures like Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century. 3, practical medicine. Surgeons and apothecaries gained greater prominence as their hands-on approaches seemed more effective than abstract theories. The experience of the plague also contributed to broader intellectual changes. Europeans realized that traditional knowledge systems were vulnerable and that nature was more complex than previously believed. This humility before nature's power set the stage for the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. Astronomical and astrological explanations for the plague persisted, but skepticism grew. Over time, the memory of the plague nurtured an intellectual environment where observation, mathematics, and experimentation could challenge old certainties. While the concept of contagion was not fully embraced in the 14th century, the plague did reinforce the idea that proximity to the sick was dangerous. Some Italian physicians noted that clothes, bedding, or even words spoken near the infected could transmit disease. These observations resurfaced in later centuries. In the 16th century, Girolamo Fracastoro articulated a more advanced theory of contagion in his work De Contagione, which traced its intellectual lineage back to plague-era experiences. The Black Plague was not just a European phenomenon. Its memory influenced medical thought globally. In the Islamic world, physicians like Ibn al-Khatib in Granada argued that plague spread by contagion, challenging religious orthodoxy. His writings foreshadowed modern epidemiology. In Asia, plague outbreaks continued and responses varied, but the shared trauma reinforced cross-cultural awareness of epidemic disease. Together, these developments show how the Black Plague spurred a collective human effort to grapple with the mysteries of illness, even before science could fully explain it. The Great Pandemic of 1347–1351 is often remembered as the Black Death, but in reality it was only the beginning of what historians call the Second Plague Pandemic. After the initial wave, plague recurred repeatedly for more than 300 years, striking Europe, the Middle East and Asia in cycles. Although none of the later outbreaks matched the mortality of the first wave, their persistence meant that plague became a regular, dreaded feature of life in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. Generations grew up expecting that another epidemic could return at any time. The first major recurrence came only a decade after the initial catastrophe. Known as the Children's Plague, the outbreak of 1361–1362 earned its name because many adults had already developed some immunity, while children, born after the first wave, were especially vulnerable. Mortality was again high, though not as catastrophic as 1347–1351. In England, it is estimated that about 20% of the population perished. Chroniclers noted with dismay that survivors of the original outbreak had believed themselves safe, only to watch their children succumb. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, plague resurfaced every decade or so. Major recurrences struck in 1369, 1374, 1400, 1501, 1430s, 1470s. Each outbreak varied in intensity, sometimes local, sometimes continental. Cities like Florence, London and Paris were hit repeatedly. Maritime trade continued to play a key role, with ships carrying plague from port to port. The plague remained entrenched in Europe during the 1500s. Italy, Spain and the Low Countries suffered frequent recurrences, often devastating urban centres. In 1575–1577, a severe epidemic struck northern Italy, killing tens of thousands in Venice and Milan. Governments refined their responses. Venetian authorities, for example, improved quarantine laws and expanded their lazarettos, plague hospitals. Yet even with stricter controls, plague remained impossible to eradicate. The 1600s saw some of the last great European outbreaks, but they were among the deadliest since the 14th century. The Italian Plague, 1629–1631. Brought by soldiers during the 30 Years' War, it devastated northern Italy, killing nearly half the population of Milan. The Great Plague of Seville, 1647–1652. This outbreak killed around 60,000 people in the city and 150,000 in the wider region, severely weakening Spain's economic and imperial power. The Great Plague of London, 1665–1666. One of the most infamous outbreaks, it killed an estimated 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's population. Contemporary diarists like Samuel Pepys recorded the fear and chaos, while government orders shut theatres, restricted movement, and marked infected houses with red crosses. While Western Europe saw its last major outbreaks by the late 17th century, the plague persisted longer in Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Outbreaks continued to ravage Istanbul, the Balkans and Russia well into the 18th century. In Russia, the Moscow Plague of 1770–1772 killed over 100,000 and sparked riots against quarantine measures. These late epidemics show how plague remained a major threat outside Western Europe, even as the West began to escape its grip. The persistence of plague over centuries is explained by several factors. 1. Reservoir in rodents. Yersinia pestis continued to circulate in wild rodent populations, especially in Asia and Eastern Europe, spilling over into human populations periodically. 2. Trade and travel. Ships, caravans and armies carried fleas and rats into new regions, reigniting outbreaks. 3. Urban conditions. Overcrowding, poor sanitation and malnutrition in medieval and early modern cities created ideal environments for the disease. 4. Limited medical knowledge. Without an understanding of bacteria, fleas or rats, authorities could not eliminate the true causes. By the early 18th century, plague began to recede from Western Europe. The reasons remain debated. Improvements in public health and quarantine, better urban sanitation, changes in rat populations, the replacement of the black rat by the brown rat, which lived farther from humans, gradual development of immunity among survivors. Whatever the causes, the last major Western European outbreak occurred in Marseille in 1720–1722, killing about 100,000. After that, plague retreated to Eastern Europe and Asia, eventually resurfacing globally only during the third plague pandemic of the 19th century. The recurrence of plague left deep scars on European society. Each generation feared its return, and cultural memory reinforced the trauma. Even when the disease finally vanished from Western Europe, it remained a ghost in the European imagination, an ever-present reminder of human vulnerability. Before and after the Black Plague, smallpox was one of the most devastating diseases in human history. Like plague, smallpox spread rapidly, killed millions, and left deep marks on societies. Yet the two diseases differed in important ways. Transmission. Smallpox spread directly from person to person via droplets, while plague relied on fleas, rats, and sometimes airborne pneumonic transmission. Mortality. Both were highly lethal, though smallpox mortality typically ranged from 20–40%, while plague outbreaks often killed 30–60% of populations and up to 90% in pneumonic cases. Legacy. Smallpox became endemic in many societies, striking regularly until the modern era. The Black Plague, by contrast, struck in waves but then receded from Europe. One key difference is that smallpox was eventually eradicated in 1980 through vaccination, while plague, though rare, still exists in some parts of the world. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918–1919, which killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, is often compared to the Black Death in scale and shock. Global reach. Unlike the medieval plague, which was largely limited to Eurasia and North Africa, the Spanish flu was truly global, spread by soldiers and ships during World War I. Speed. Flu spread far faster than plague, circling the globe in months rather than years. Modern transportation networks accelerated its transmission. Demographics. The flu disproportionately killed young adults while plague struck across all ages. Public health response. By 1918, governments had more advanced tools, including germ theory and rudimentary vaccines, yet containment still proved impossible. Both pandemics reshaped societies, strained governments, and left survivors traumatized by mass death. Each also inspired new public health measures and a re-evaluation of medical preparedness. The cholera pandemics of the 19th century, spread from India through trade routes, echoed some features of the Black Plague. Association with sanitation. Just as plague thrived in filthy, crowded conditions, cholera spread in places with contaminated water supplies. Public panic. In both pandemics, fear led to scapegoating and riots against health measures. Public health advances. Cholera outbreaks pushed governments to improve urban sanitation, paralleling how plague spurred quarantines and hospitals centuries earlier. Cholera thus continued the plague's legacy of shaping the relationship between disease, governance, and urban life. The COVID-19 pandemic, caused by the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, offers striking modern parallels with the Black Plague, despite vast differences in science and mortality. Similarities: fear and uncertainty. Like medieval Europeans, people in 2020 faced an invisible, little-understood disease that spread globally. Quarantine and isolation. Medieval quarantines and modern lockdowns reflected the same logic of separating the sick from the healthy. Economic disruption. Both pandemics disrupted trade, labor, and economies, though COVID's disruptions came in a globalized digital age. Scapegoating. Just as Jews were targeted in the 14th century, Asian communities and migrants faced discrimination during COVID-19. Differences. Medical capacity. COVID-19 was met with advanced science, rapid genome sequencing, and vaccines developed within a year, an unimaginable achievement in plague times. Mortality. COVID-19's mortality rate was far lower, though its global reach meant millions still died. The Black Plague killed a much higher percentage of the population in affected regions. Communication. Unlike the 14th century, where rumor and religious authority shaped responses, the 21st century saw real-time global communication, though misinformation still thrived. Despite differences in pathogens and contexts, pandemics reveal common human responses. 1. Fear and flight. People flee cities, isolate, or turn inward to protect themselves. 2. Faith and superstition. Religion, ritual, and magical thinking accompany medical efforts. Scapegoating. Minority groups are often blamed when fear overwhelms reason. 4. Economic and social shifts. Pandemics disrupt labor, trade, and family life, reshaping societies. 5. Cultural reflections. Art, literature, and memory preserve the trauma, ensuring pandemics remain part of collective identity. Each pandemic has forced humanity to rethink its relationship with disease. The Black Plague spurred quarantines and challenged medieval medicine. Smallpox led to vaccination. Cholera inspired sanitation reforms. Spanish flu reinforced the need for global health monitoring. COVID-19 renewed focus on preparedness, vaccines, and the vulnerabilities of global interconnectedness. Yet history also shows that lessons are often forgotten. Complacency between pandemics leaves societies vulnerable, just as Europe was unprepared for plague recurrences after 1351 or for COVID-19 in 2020. The most obvious legacy of the Black Plague was demographic collapse. Europe's population, estimated at 75–80 million before 1347, may have fallen to as low as 50 million by 1351. Recovery was slow. In some regions, it took nearly 200 years to return to pre-plague numbers. This massive depopulation changed the balance between people and resources. With fewer mouths to feed, survivors often enjoyed improved diets and better living conditions. Land that had been overworked was abandoned, leading to healthier agricultural cycles. Families who survived sometimes inherited property, leading to upward social mobility. In the long term, the plague reduced the rigid pressures of overpopulation and scarcity, ironically improving life expectancy for later generations. The plague accelerated the decline of feudalism, weakening the bonds of serfdom and empowering peasants. Labor shortages forced lords to make concessions, and government's attempts to freeze wages led to revolts that shook the old order. Over time, this contributed to the rise of a more flexible, wage-based economy. Urban centers gained prominence, trade networks revived, and the seeds of early capitalism were sown. Some historians argue that the plague helped lay the foundation for the Renaissance economy, and eventually, the rise of modern market systems. The cultural legacy of the plague extended far beyond the immediate trauma. The omnipresence of death gave rise to new artistic and literary themes. Memento mori art and the dance of death reminded people of mortality. Writers like Boccaccio and Chaucer reflected a world haunted by suffering but also hungry for humor and storytelling. Philosophical skepticism grew, as reliance on ancient authorities and religious explanations seemed increasingly inadequate. This atmosphere encouraged intellectual questioning, which would flourish in the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The plague did not cause these movements directly, but it created a climate where old certainties could be challenged. Religiously, the plague weakened confidence in the church. Priests and monks died in great numbers, and the failure of prayers to stop the disease led some to doubt ecclesiastical authority. While devotion remained strong, seeds of skepticism were planted, contributing centuries later to the Reformation. The cult of saints associated with plague protection, such as Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, also flourished. Popular religion adapted, showing resilience even as official institutions faltered. One of the most enduring legacies was the birth of public health systems. Quarantine health boards, lazarettos, and sanitation measures became standard in European cities. Governments began to recognize their responsibility to protect populations from disease, an idea that would grow in importance in the modern era. This marked a shift in governance. Rulers and councils were expected not only to enforce law and collect taxes, but also to safeguard the physical well-being of their subjects. The psychological scars of the Black Plague endured for centuries. Survivors lived with memories of horror, mass death, and social collapse. A heightened awareness of life's fragility pervaded European thought. This psychological legacy can be seen in the art of the Renaissance, the preoccupation with mortality and philosophy, and the recurrent fear whenever new diseases appeared. Even when plague receded, it remained a cultural memory, a specter of death that haunted European imagination. Historians debate how much the Black Plague directly influenced the Renaissance, but many agree it played a role. By disrupting the old order, redistributing wealth, and encouraging skepticism, the plague helped create conditions for renewal. In Italy, devastated cities like Florence eventually experienced rebirth in art, science, and humanism. Survivors invested wealth into patronage, while the trauma of the plague gave urgency to new ideas about life, nature, and human potential. The Black Plague also holds enduring lessons. It demonstrated humanity's vulnerability to disease and the limits of existing knowledge. It showed how pandemics reshape societies, economically, politically, and culturally. And it underscored the recurring themes of fear, scapegoating, resilience, and renewal that characterize human responses to crisis. In the 21st century, the memory of the plague resonates strongly. During the COVID-19 pandemic, journalists, scholars, and citizens often looked back to the Black Death for comparisons. Its story continues to inform how we understand pandemics, mortality, and social change. The Black Plague was more than a biological catastrophe. It was a profound turning point in the story of Europe, and by extension, the world. Between 1347 and 1351, it cut down nearly a third to half of the continent's population, shattering families, communities, and institutions. Its recurrence over the next 3 centuries kept Europe in a state of chronic vulnerability, reinforcing the ever-present reality of death. Yet the plague's legacy extended far beyond mortality. Socially, it dismantled traditional bonds of loyalty and kinship, forcing survivors to renegotiate the very meaning of community. Economically, it accelerated the decline of feudalism, empowered laborers, and redistributed wealth in ways that encouraged social mobility. Politically, it destabilized monarchies, undermined the church's authority, and gave rise to revolts and experiments in governance. Culturally, it created a world haunted by death, but also invigorated by new artistic, literary, and philosophical energies. The plague's impact on medicine and science was equally profound. It revealed the weaknesses of traditional medical knowledge, spurred the development of public health measures like quarantine, and set the stage for empirical approaches that would eventually blossom in the Renaissance and Enlightenment. In this way, the plague, though tragic, indirectly paved the way for modernity. Above all, the Black Plague forced humanity to confront the fragility of existence. Medieval Europeans interpreted it through the lenses of faith, superstition, and limited science, but their struggles resonate even today. The pandemic revealed both the darkest aspects of humanity, fear, scapegoating, and cruelty, and its most resilient traits, compassion, adaptation, and renewal. In the centuries since, the memory of the Black Plague has persisted as both a warning and a source of reflection. It reminds us that disease is not merely a medical event, but a social, cultural, and existential challenge. It teaches that crises, however destructive, can also be catalysts for transformation. Thus, the Black Plague stands not only as one of history's greatest tragedies, but also as a moment of profound rebirth. Out of the ashes of despair emerged a Europe transformed, leaner, more dynamic, and better prepared to embark on the new worlds of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually the modern age.